The year is 1997. Nintendo, the once powerful and omnipotent force in the gaming industry, had been cast down from atop its throne after a struggle for power had decimated many newcomers to the console market. But in the end, the Sony PlayStation would emerge victorious, altering the gaming landscape permanently and casting Sega into an improbable position. However, Sega would not go down without a fight, and they would soon reveal their plans to the world.
Sega had some of the worst years between 94 and 96, and I'm not talking about financially, I'm talking about the actual Sega brand. The Sega CD was not the major hit that Sega had hoped for. In fact, CD gaming in general during the early years was not everything gamers had hoped for. Sega of America and Sega of Japan were engaged in an internal struggle. Long story short, the 32X and the Sega Saturn were released almost back-to-back in Japan, and with only a few months into the 32X life in the West, the Saturn was released several months ahead of schedule, totally taking Sega of America and its consumers by surprise. The early release meant very limited software and 32X owners feeling burned by Sega themselves, not to mention Sega of America. The complicated architecture of the Saturn meant that most developers would move on to the PlayStation console or would have inferior ports when compared to the new console on the block. When the N64 was released, it further took away from Sega's market share. They suddenly found themselves in third place by a long shot. So Sega of Japan removed Tom Kalinske as president and CEO of Sega of America and cleaned house as it prepared its next move. The concept for the Dreamcast began as early as 1995, with rumors of Sega working with some companies like Alliance Semiconductor and 3DO to create a new chipset for their next console. But it wasn't until 1997 that the new president of Sega of Japan, Shoichiro Irimahiri, did the unthinkable and decided to hand off the design of the new chipset to an outside skunkworks team that will be spearheaded by Tatsuo Yamamoto of IBM. However, Hideki Sato, who was in charge of the internal hardware design for Sega, refused to accept the idea that Sega would hire an outside team and continue to design the new chipset on his own with his team, finally settling on the Hitachi SH4 with a PowerVR processor by NEC. This chipset was codenamed White Belt, with the motherboard being called Katana. Around that same time, Tatsuo's team also settled on the Hitachi SH4, but with a 3DFX Voodoo 2 processor. This chipset was codenamed Black Belt. The motherboard for it was ultimately labeled Doral. The newly labeled Dreamcast had some pretty hefty specs when compared to the massively popular PlayStation and even the N64. It came with the Hitachi SH4 running at 200 MHz and the PowerVR 2 clocking at 100 MHz and a whopping 16 MB of RAM, which was a big deal in those days. Sega saw the rise of multiplayer as a popular means of gaming not only locally, but the possibilities of what the internet could bring to the table as far as multiplayer went. The Dreamcast would become the first system with a built-in LAN adapter that would allow it to connect to Sega Net, a gaming service that allowed players to connect via one another through Sega servers, which was something fairly new for video game console owners back then. The decision to go with a non-DVD format would prove to be a costly one, but at the time, it did seem to be the right solution, cost-wise. DVD players were still expensive to build, and integrating it into their new console would have probably placed the cost of the unit too high for consumers, also eating away at Sega's profit with every console sold. So Sega partnered with Yamaha in designing a disc capable of holding more than the CD standard of 700 megabytes. The GD-ROM or Gigadisc could hold up to 1.2 gigabytes of data. They resemble CDs, but pits on the surface were closer together, meaning more data could be condensed and packed into them. This would only require Sega to create a laser system to read them, keeping costs down. Some Dreamcast games came with an audio track at the beginning of the disc, warning players that this was no regular CD, as indicated by this track found on the Skies of Arcadia disc when played back on a CD player.
Hey! Wait a minute! What do you think you're doing? This is a Dreamcast disc!
There is game data on track 1. So please, don't use this disc in a normal CD player.
We can't save the world from a CD player, so just put us back in the Dreamcast so we can do our job.
In keeping with the importance of multiplayer, Sega placed 4 controller ports on the Dreamcast, similar to what Nintendo did with the N64, and we all know how much fun those multiplayer games were on that system. But what are ports in games with no controllers? Sega brought something new to the table by incorporating a small VMU to be used with the controllers. These VMUs were sold separately, but played a very important role not only for the games, but the controller in general. Now, how is that, you ask? Well, let's look at it. Getting your hands on one of the Dreamcast controllers felt like you were only getting half of it, as it felt like something was missing with a huge open space right here in the middle. The VMUs could display different things on it depending on the game being played, like in Sonic Adventure, where you could grow your own Chao, much like a Tamagotchi of that time. Or more importantly, being able to bring up your plays in sport games through the VMU without letting your opponent see them. That was a pretty huge innovation. They also served as your memory card, so buying one was not really an option. However, there was plenty of negative feedback when Sega decided to opt out of a second analog joystick and went with a single joystick followed by a very mediocre D-pad, after Sony and Nintendo both made use of dual analog sticks on their controllers. The layout of the Dreamcast controller left somewhat of a sour taste for many gamers. The cord for the controller came out through the front, making it odd, allowing it to be clipped on at the bottom so it wouldn't get in the way. There were a few interesting accessories for the system. You had the fishing rod controller, which was made specifically for Sega Bass Fishing, but did you know that you could also play King of Fighters with it? You had the keyboard, which was great for the Typing of the Dead, Phantasy Star Online, and using it in conjunction with the mouse, it made first-person shooters a lot easier to play on the console. There was a light gun that was released in Japan only. Damn, what a shame we never got these released here originally. They look awesome. The jump pack was another accessory that was inserted into the controller slot to add vibration functionality with some games. There was also a massive arcade-style controller for those that wanted the arcade experience when playing fighting games, like Street Fighter 3, Street Fighter Alpha, and Capcom vs SNK, to name a few. There was also the Dream Eye, a camera that was released and planned to be used not only in games, but at one point, Sega was toying with the idea of partnering with Motorola to make video calls using the console. It was a Japan exclusive that came bundled with Visual Pack. There was also a twin stick controller that was released only in Japan, and that was odd looking but interesting. Also unknown to many out there is that the WonderSwan and the Dreamcast were to be compatible with one another, so that games like SNK's King of Fighters could have fighter info and other options be transferable via the serial port on the back of the Dreamcast. Now, before we get to the games, we have to address the operating system for it, Windows CE. It was used as a means for Sega to easily port over their games to the PC, as it was seen as a quickly expanding market. Some out there have blamed the inclusion of a Windows-based system as part of the console's downfall, but I'm gonna get to that topic in a bit. Sega put a lot of effort into making sure that the North American launch of the Dreamcast would be a success. The company had burned many bridges with the Saturn launch, leaving many direct suppliers and vendors out of the loop upon launching the system back in '94. Gamers were also left with a bitter taste in their mouths after dealing with so many add-ons and failed promises by the company. Close to launch, the company would hit a snag when it was told by EA that they would not develop any games for their new system for a few reasons. One being that EA wanted exclusive rights to be the only sports brand on the new Dreamcast system. However, Sega has signed a deal with Visual Concepts for $10 million, meaning that EA would have to compete with another company for sport bragging rights on the Dreamcast. And we all know that EA does not like to compete, because that means they need to innovate and be creative. God forbid they would have to put any effort into any of the sports games. Sega partnered with Hollywood video outlets to promote the unit and make it available for rental as early as July of 1999, 2 months before its official launch, allowing gamers an early look at all the hype. And in order to keep that hype train going before launch, they aggressively promoted the new console with its marketing campaign, rallying with the tagline, "It's thinking."
This is the day you have trained for. The day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills. your superior intelligence.
Sit down, rodent!
Sarah, baby! Oh, you were one fly.
Don't make me hurt you. Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve of Hackensack.
Ryan, you're gonna get roofed.
Shut up, quadruped.
Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
After some hiccups back in Japan with the production of the VR chipsets, hindering availability and preventing pre-orders from being completely fulfilled, as well as only having 4 games at launch, it was time for the North American launch.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's round 1, and Sega is flexing its newfound muscles with its brand new game system called Dreamcast.
This is the first time I ever played it.
First time for Matt Mignogno.
Whoa.
Because this is the first day it went on sale.
I expect it to do really well.
Sales that are expected to bring in $45 million, and that's just today. Dreamcast will bring in more in one day than even the hit movie Star Wars: The Phantom Menace made on its opening day. What does Sega's Dreamcast have that Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's 64 don't?
It's actually a system that can go interactive. You can plug it into your phone line.
For the first time, a video game system will allow you to play your opponent who doesn't even have to be in the same room, in the same city, or the same state. You'll be able to play online.
We believe the future of gaming is the internet, and the Sega Dreamcast provides internet connectivity, a 56K built-in modem at $199. At launch, email, chat, and an unbelievable amount of content.
On top of a great launch that saw Sega sell through over 225,000 units, making it one of the best console launches up to that point in time and giving Sega a $98 million boost, the marketing, the hype, it had come together perfectly.
Matt Mignogno doesn't care who wins the fight as long as he keeps playing the games. Imagine a world without them.
It wouldn't be too fun. When you're bored, you wouldn't have anything to do.
And we can't have that. John Sharifi, Channel 2 News.
The Dreamcast had 18 games available for launch. Headlining the launch lineup was Sonic Adventure. After missing out completely on the Saturn, it was imperative that Sega included their blue mascot with the new console. Not having Sonic on the Saturn was like a Nintendo console with no main Mario entry. Sonic Adventure was the 3D entry that he deserved, and that gamers and most importantly, Sega fans had been clamoring for. That alone helped solidify the console as a legit contender and a sign that Sega was on the right track once again. There was a little for everyone on this launch. Sport fans had a reason to be very excited after seeing EA back out of the Dreamcast altogether. NFL 2K was leaps and bounds above any football game of that time. If you wanted a more arcade feel to football, however, you also had NFL Blitz. There was also boxing, Grand Prix racing, off-road racing, even hoverboard racing. And if for some reason car racing wasn't your thing, you also had boat racing thanks to Hydro Thunder. Horror game fans had Blue Stinger, which was a take on the Resident Evil formula, and House of the Dead, which was an on-rail shooter with a horror twist to it, and very popular in the arcades. Fighting game fans had the perfect title in Soul Calibur, one of the best looking Dreamcast games and some might even argue one of the best arena fighting games of all time, And you know what? It's hard to argue with that. You can still pick up this game today and marvel at not only the looks, but the very tight and deep gameplay mechanics it brings to the table. You also had Mortal Kombat Gold and the incredibly fun-filled Power Stone from Capcom, which spiced up the fighting game formula by confining the fighters into a small arena, keeping the action frantic and tense. Flight Sim fans had two titles to choose from, Air Force Delta and Aero Wings. Both are nice flight simulations with a little bit of an arcade feel to them. If none of these genres offered anything to you, then you also had the wild shoot-'em-up game by the name of Expendables. It is an over-the-top view, all-out mayhem action set shooter that has you traversing levels and destroying all sorts of environments and enemies, as well as large bosses. A Contra-style game that was actually better than any of the Contra games of that time. And then there's Pen Pen Chill Salon, if that's how you pronounce it. It's not a true racer, it's not a platformer, barely a mascot racer, it's Pen Pen Trail Salon. You know, all jokes aside, the Dreamcast came out swinging for the fences, and for a short while, the system exceeded all expectations. Gamers had a huge selection to choose from, the hardware was way ahead of what the PS1 and the N64 had in store. It had managed to go through 300,000 pre-sold units, plus another 225,000 sold on launch day. In fact, I think even Sega themselves didn't expect it to go so well. Unfortunately, they could not keep up with demand, and this is where some of the problems started. So what exactly went wrong for Sega with the Dreamcast? After all I just mentioned, it seems that everything went well during the launch here in the US. You had a powerful system, you had tons of games spanning several genres, you finally had a Sonic 3D game worthy of the Sonic brand, the hype surrounding it was aggressive, third-party support was there for the most part, minus EA.
Hell with them!
Here in the US, the launch had been plagued by some discs that had been burned improperly during the manufacturing process, leaving gamers with titles that did not work at all from day one, and that left a very bad impression that brought back flashbacks from the mid-90s and Sega's missteps during that time. The percentage of these discs wasn't huge overall, but it was a bad first impression for Sega, who were still reeling from many bad decisions prior to the Dreamcast release. But Sega had an even bigger problem. With the PS2 being announced as early as July of 1999, not being able to meet demands meant gamers now had itchy fingers and a burning wallet in their pockets. So the prospect of the PS2 being advertised for a late 2000 release did not help. Gamers were willing to wait. On top of that, the PS2 was advertised to have a built-in DVD drive with a reasonable price tag, which alone was a big draw. DVD systems alone were still expensive back then, and Sony was offering gamers not only a huge upgrade from their massively popular PS1 with specs that were superior to the Dreamcast, but a home game system with a built-in DVD drive for only slightly more than a standalone DVD player. Plus, the rising new media could hold 4.7 gigabytes of data if single-sided and up to 8.5 if double-sided. This meant that games on the PS2 could be way bigger than on the Dreamcast, therefore packing more content for gamers. Thanks to the PS2, you could now watch the new film Battlefield Earth on high def on your new DVD game system. You're welcome. Now, some out there would say that piracy did the system in, but that was not the case here. It didn't help, but it wasn't the main cause of its downfall. This special version of Windows CE was designed for the Dreamcast, but only as a way for developers to access tools to create games. Sega actually went a different route and included tools within the disk that developers found easier to use in creating games. But the reality is that the Dreamcast lockout was bypassed not through Windows CE, but the boot option that was placed on the Dreamcast to utilize regular CD-ROMs on the unit. I'm not going to get into the whole nitty-gritty of it, but in the end, even though piracy was prevalent, it mostly took place towards the end of the Dreamcast life, which was surprisingly shorter than most out there remember, spanning only 2 years and 4 months before it was discontinued by Sega. The reality is that the PS2 juggernaut was just too much for the entire 6th generation of consoles, as you can see on the chart here. And the Dreamcast was the first console out of the gate, meaning it had the weakest specs when compared to all the other consoles. So this, coupled with unable to meet demands during the Christmas of 2000 and afterwards, rising piracy, a very small user base, and massive price cuts and promotions to help move inventory, meant Sega's profits kept dwindling. By the end of 2000, Sega had reported a net loss of just over $320 million. In January of 2001, newly appointed Sega president Isao Okawa suggested to the board of Sega that they should abandon the hardware business and focus primarily on software development. On January 31st of 2001, Sega announced that they would discontinue the Dreamcast as of March 31st of that year. The company will greatly discount remaining inventory of Dreamcast consoles. You could get one as cheap as $99.99 before they eventually fell all the way down to $49.99. The very last Dreamcast console would be signed by every game developer and would include all first-party Dreamcast games, which total 55. This giveaway was promoted by GamePro magazine. And with that, the Dreamcast and Sega's run on the hardware home console market came to an end. But for a short time, it seemed like Sega was back. Instead, its demise and collaboration with Microsoft helped the Xbox enter the home console market, making it a three-way race that stands in place even today. But as a gamer back then, you couldn't help but root for Sega, and it seemed like they would pull through. A shame too, as the Dreamcast was one hell of a console. I bought one on Christmas of '99 with Sonic and NFL 2K and Crazy Taxi a few months later, and I was hooked. So much so that I skipped the PS2 and went straight to the GameCube for my next console. But that is a story for another video. 25 years after its release, the Dreamcast is still considered to be one of the best consoles for its time, with a slew of great game titles that are fun to play today as they were 20 plus years ago, while also regarded as being one of the best consoles released by Sega, if not the best. Many out there are still waiting for a Dreamcast Mini. Now, whether this comes to fruition is anyone's guess. So, what are your thoughts on the Dreamcast, whether you owned one or not? Does it live up to its legacy? To the hype? Now stay tuned for my next video where I will be talking about one of the quirkiest games ever to be created, and it's celebrating its 20th anniversary this month. Be here for that. Until then, keep watching and keep gaming.
Let's look at the funk.
Could you stop playing with that radio of yours? I'm trying to get to sleep. Could you stop playing with that radio of yours? I'm trying to get to sleep.